I have spent 79 years learning how to read silence. 31 of those years were spent inside courtrooms and boardrooms and quiet offices where families sat across from one another and pretended that money was the only thing being divided. I knew better. I always knew better. After decades practicing estate law in this city, after holding the hands of widows and widowers and estranged siblings and reluctant heirs, I understood something that most people only learn too late. The documents were never the hardest part. The hardest part was the conversation that nobody was willing to start. I thought I had learned everything there was to learn about silence. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when I woke up in a hospital bed at Royal Jubilee. Hospital, with a thin cotton blanket pulled to my chin and the particular kind of fluorescent light overhead that makes every room feel like it exists outside of time. My procedure had been routine, or as routine as anything feels when you are 79 years old, and the word routine is doing an enormous amount of work to reassure everyone involved. A cardiac monitoring intervention, my cardiologist had called it. Nothing dramatic, nothing requiring extended admission. I would be home by Wednesday afternoon if everything continued as expected. I was not frightened. I want to be clear about that, because I think people assume a woman of my age spends a great deal of time being frightened by hospitals and procedures and the ordinary vocabulary of medical care. I did not. I had made my peace with impermanence a long time ago, in the same methodical way I had made peace with most difficult things, by examining it carefully, by understanding its terms, and by refusing to let it govern my decisions out of panic rather than reason. What I had not accounted for was waking up before I was expected to. The morning light was still pale and thin against the window blinds when I became aware of voices in the hallway. The door to my room was not fully closed. Someone had left it ajar by perhaps 6 or 8 inches, enough for the corridor sounds to drift through. At first, I registered only the ambient noise of the ward, the soft squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the distant murmur of a nurse's station, the muted announcement of something routine over an intercom somewhere further down the hall. And then I heard my daughter-in-law's voice. Claire has a particular quality in her voice when she is exhausted, not sharp, not unkind, but stripped of its usual careful composure, as though the effort of maintaining her professional steadiness has finally cost more than she has left to spend. I recognized that quality immediately, even before my mind had fully assembled itself out of the drowsy fog of the previous evening. She was speaking quietly, not whispering. The kind of quiet that is not trying to hide anything so much as it is trying not to disturb. I did not move. I'm not sure I was fully capable of moving just then. I lay still with the blanket at my chin and my eyes not quite open, and I listened. The way I used to listen in courtrooms when opposing counsel thought I had already stopped paying attention. "If she never tells us what she really wanted," Claire said, "we'll spend the rest of our lives wondering whether we failed her." There was a pause. I knew Nathan's silences. My son has always thought before he speaks, a quality I take some private credit for. And this particular silence had the texture of someone searching for words that felt adequate. "I wish we had talked about it years ago," he said. And then the hallway sounds shifted. Footsteps moved away. The door was not adjusted. The 6-inch gap remained, but the voices were gone, replaced again by the ordinary sounds of a hospital morning doing its unremarkable work. I opened my eyes. The ceiling above me was exactly as uninteresting as hospital ceilings always are. A pale institutional surface with a recessed lighting panel and a small sprinkler fitting and nothing else. I stared at it for what felt like a long time. I am a woman who has spent her professional life parsing language. I know the difference between what words say and what words mean. I know how to read tone and context and the particular emotional architecture of a sentence. And I understood, lying there in that hospital bed with the cotton blanket pulled to my chin, that what I had just heard was not hostility. It was not resentment. It was not the sound of 2 people calculating what they might receive. It was the sound of 2 people who were frightened that the woman they loved would leave this world and take something unspoken with her. That understanding settled over me slowly, the way the light through the blinds was settling into the room, gradual and without drama. And with it came something I had not expected, a recognition that I, Margaret Lawson, who had built an entire career on the importance of clarity and communication and the written articulation of human intention, had failed to apply any of those principles to the people who mattered most to me. I had assumed they knew. I had assumed, in the way that intelligent people sometimes assume the most damaging things, that because I understood my own intentions clearly, those intentions were somehow legible to the people around me, that my values were obvious, that my wishes were self-evident, that the love underneath every decision I had ever made about my estate and my home and the life I had built on Government Street was somehow radiating outward in a form that required no words. I had been, in the language I would have used in court without hesitation, entirely mistaken. Victoria was doing what Victoria does in late October when I was discharged the following afternoon, which is to say, it was being quietly, persistently beautiful in a way that felt almost impolite given the circumstances. The inner harbor caught the afternoon light at an angle that turned the water the color of old pewter shot through with silver. The Empress sat at the edge of it the way it always had, solid and slightly formal, the kind of building that seems to have made a private decision never to be surprised by anything. The drive home along Dallas Road took me past the ocean, past the rocky shoreline where the waves came in low and regular under an autumn sky the color of smoke and steel. My home on Government Street had been part of my life for 41 years. My late husband Gerald and I had found it together, a heritage property built in the early 1900s, with original fir floors and tall ceilings, and windows that let in the particular quality of Vancouver Island light that I had decided, the first time I saw it, I could not live without. Gerald had been gone for 11 years. The house remained, as houses do, holding the specific shape of all the lives that had moved through it. I did not go inside immediately. I sat in the back of the car for a moment after my neighbor Dorothy, who had collected me from the hospital with characteristic efficiency and without making a fuss about it, had pulled into the driveway. I sat and I looked at the front of the house, the ivy that needed attention, the window boxes that had gone past their season, the front door that Gerald had painted a particular shade of dark blue that I had never changed. And I made a decision. The decision was simple in structure, though I understood it was not simple in execution. I needed to make a phone call, not to Nathan, not to Claire, not yet. I needed to call Arthur Pemberton. Arthur had been a solicitor for longer than most people could accurately imagine. He was in his early 80s now, technically retired, but Arthur Pemberton's version of retirement involved maintaining a small private practice out of an office above a bookshop on Fort Street, because Arthur was constitutionally incapable of sitting still and had decided that the legal profession was a more dignified alternative to whatever the other options were. I had known him for 35 years. He had drafted Gerald's estate documents and subsequently my own, and I trusted his judgment in the way that you trust the judgment of someone who has never once told you what you wanted to hear when what you needed to hear was something else. Dorothy brought me inside, confirmed that I had food in the kitchen and nothing urgent on the stove, and left with the kind of tactful discretion that has always been her most admirable quality. I sat in the chair by the front window, Gerald's chair still, in all the ways that matter, and I picked up the telephone. Arthur answered on the third ring, because Arthur always answers on the third ring, a habit I have never interrogated and have always found oddly reassuring. "Margaret," he said, in the tone of a man who is genuinely pleased to hear a voice and is not performing that pleasure. "I had heard you'd been at Royal Jubilee. Are you home?" "I'm home," I said. "Arthur, I need to speak with you about the estate documents. Not to change the beneficiaries. I need to suspend the existing instructions." There was a pause. Not a long one. Arthur was not a man who required long pauses to process information. "Suspend them," he repeated, "until I have had an opportunity to sit down with Nathan and Claire and explain, in my own words, the reasoning behind every decision I've made. I should have done this years ago. I didn't. I am doing it now. Another pause, shorter. I can come to you tomorrow morning, he said, if you're well enough to receive me. I am well enough, I said. I've had a cardiac monitoring procedure, Arthur. I haven't lost my faculties. No, he said, with a quiet warmth that I recognized as his version of affection. You certainly have not. We made the arrangement for 10 o'clock the following morning. I placed the receiver back in its cradle and sat for a moment in Gerald's chair, watching the late afternoon light change its angle on the floor. The furboards caught it in a way that always reminded me of a particular October afternoon 41 years ago, when Gerald and I had stood in this same room with the estate agent, waiting patiently in the hallway, and Gerald had looked at the light on the floor and said simply that this was the one. He had been right, as he was right about a great many things. He had also been, as I was beginning to understand, with a clarity that the hospital ceiling had somehow helped me achieve, a man who kept a great many of his most important thoughts to himself. Not out of secrecy. Out of the same assumption I had made, that the people he loved understood him without needing the words. I was beginning to wonder whether that assumption had cost our family more than either of us had ever recognized. Arthur arrived at 10 o'clock the following morning, as promised, carrying a battered leather satchel that I recognized from our very first meeting 3 decades earlier and that showed no signs of being replaced. He accepted tea, settled himself at the dining table, the long mahogany table where Gerald and I had signed documents and celebrated milestones, and had the ordinary shared meals that accumulate, over decades, into the substance of a life, and spread the estate files across its surface with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this thousands of times and had never once treated it as merely procedural. We worked through the morning. I explained each decision I had made, the property provisions, the charitable bequests, the allocation of personal items, the trust arrangements that Gerald and I had established together during the years before his illness had made planning a matter of urgency rather than preference. Arthur listened with the focused attention that I had always valued in him, not interrupting, not anticipating, not guiding me toward a conclusion he had already reached, simply listening. It was during this review that he paused over a section of documents I had not examined closely in many years. "Margaret," he said, setting down his pen with the careful deliberateness of a man who has decided something needs to be said and is choosing his moment precisely. "I want to draw your attention to something." He turned a document toward me across the table. It was a property agreement, one of the original documents from the Heritage property purchase, combined with a subsequent charitable arrangement that Gerald and I had established in the mid-90s. I looked at it. I recognized it. And then, as my eyes moved across the pages, I began to see what Arthur had already seen. The dates were inconsistent, not dramatically, not in a way that would have registered as alarming during any of the routine reviews we had conducted over the years. But when placed alongside the charitable foundation records that Arthur drew from the satchel, documents related to a trust arrangement that Gerald and I had quietly created for the preservation of heritage properties across Vancouver Island, the timelines did not align in the way I had always believed they did. Gerald had made changes, small ones, careful ones, changes I had known about or thought I had known about. But the documentation suggested something that I had never fully understood. "I think," Arthur said, with the measured care of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say, "that we may need to involve the British Columbia Land Title Office. And I think we may discover that the history of this estate is somewhat more layered than either of us has been working from." I sat with that for a moment. 79 years old, 31 years of estate law practice, 41 years in this house, and I was looking at documents that suggested my husband, my careful, quiet, deeply private husband, had arranged something significant without fully explaining it to me. I understood, in that moment, why Claire had sounded the way she had in that hospital corridor. Because I, too, was now sitting with the particular weight of words that had never quite been spoken. and I was only beginning to understand how much that weight had accumulated. The land title office was located on Fort Street, a short distance from Arthur's own office, and Arthur made the preliminary inquiry that same afternoon while I returned home to sit with the files he had left me and try to reconstruct, from memory and from the handwritten journals I kept in the drawer of Gerald's old writing desk, what I actually knew versus what I had simply assumed. The journals went back 40 years. Gerald's handwriting was in some of them, not journals of his own, but notes he had made in the margins of documents I had kept, small additions in his precise, unhurried script that I had always read as commentary, but now began to read differently. As intention, as instruction to himself, perhaps, about something he had meant to explain and had not yet found the right moment for. I had been married to Gerald Lawson for 37 years. I had believed, with the confidence of a woman who made her professional living reading between the lines of documents, that I understood him entirely. I was learning, at 79, that understanding is never quite as complete as we believe it to be. That evening, after the light had gone fully from the windows and the house had settled into its familiar night sounds, the particular creak of the third stair, the way the wind came in from the ocean and found the gap in the frame of the kitchen window that Gerald had always meant to reseal. I sat at the dining table with his journals and the estate files and a pot of tea that went cold without my noticing. And I found the first letter. It was tucked between the pages of a journal from 1997, not sealed, not dramatic in its presentation, just a folded piece of paper in Gerald's handwriting, addressed to no one in particular, that began with the words, "There are things I have done for this family that I never found the right way to explain." I read it once. Then I read it again. Then I sat very still in the quiet of the house on Government Street and understood that what I had overheard in the hospital corridor was not the beginning of a conversation about loss. It was the echo of a conversation that had been waiting for more than 20 years, for someone to finally be willing to hear it. I did not sleep that night. That is not an unusual thing for a woman of my age to say. Sleep becomes a more complicated negotiation as the years accumulate, arriving and departing on its own terms without much regard for what you might prefer. But this particular sleeplessness was not the ordinary kind. It was not the restlessness of a body that has spent too many hours in a hospital bed, or the low-grade physical discomfort that cardiac monitoring procedures tend to leave behind. It was the sleeplessness of a mind that has been handed something it cannot put down. I sat at that dining table until well past 2 in the morning, with Gerald's letter in front of me, and the tea cold in its pot, and the house doing its quiet work around me, and I read those pages more times than I could accurately count. Not because the words were difficult. Gerald had always written with the same quality he brought to everything else, precise, unadorned, without unnecessary ornamentation. Every sentence said exactly what it meant. The difficulty was not in the reading. The difficulty was in the understanding. And the understanding I was finding was something that could not be rushed. He had written the letter in the spring of 1997. I knew that year without needing to check the date he had written at the top of the page, because 1997 had its own particular texture in my memory. It was the year Nathan had turned 30, the year Arthur had first suggested we revisit the estate structure, and, though I had not thought about this in quite some time, the year Gerald had spent 3 weeks in Vancouver, attending to what he had described to me simply as a complicated business matter, involving some of the charitable foundation work we had been doing. I had not asked many questions about those 3 weeks. Gerald and I had always operated on a basis of what I suppose you might call professional trust. We were both people who managed complex matters for a living, and we had learned early in our marriage that the most useful thing a partner could do was not require a complete accounting of every detail, but rather to be available when the details became relevant. It had always worked for us, or I had always believed it had worked for us. The letter changed the texture of that belief considerably. What Gerald had written, in his careful, unhurried script on 3 pages of the cream-colored stationery he had always preferred, was not a confession. I want to be precise about that, because I think the word confession suggests something that this was not. There was no wrongdoing in those pages. There was no revelation that recast the man I had loved for 37 years into someone unrecognizable. What Gerald had written was something both simpler and more complicated than a confession. It was an explanation. In 1996, the year before he wrote the letter, Gerald had quietly restructured a portion of the charitable trust we had established together for heritage property preservation across Vancouver Island. He had not done this without authorization. He had been, as he carefully noted, operating within the terms of his trustee authority, but he had done it without discussing it with me first. He had redirected a significant portion of the trust's annual disbursement toward a specific property, a 19th-century heritage building in the Fernwood neighborhood of Victoria that was facing demolition due to the financial difficulties of its then owner. The building had been saved. It still stood, as far as I knew, though I had not thought about it in years. What Gerald had not told me, what the letter was in part an attempt to explain, was why he had chosen that particular building and why he had felt it needed to be handled quietly rather than through our usual collaborative approach. The building had belonged to a family with a long connection to Victoria's early legal community, a family that, several decades earlier, had done something quietly significant for a young woman who was trying to establish herself in a profession that did not always welcome her presence. A family whose generosity had never been formally acknowledged because the young woman in question had not known, at the time, how to acknowledge it without drawing attention to the help she had received. That young woman had been me. I sat with that for a long time in the quiet of the dining room. Gerald had known. He had always known. I had told him early in our marriage, in the way that you tell the person you love the things that shaped you, the story of how a particular connection to a particular legal family in Victoria had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed to me. I had not thought of it as a debt exactly. I had thought of it as the kind of generosity that you carry forward by being generous yourself, which is what I had tried to do across 31 years of practice. But Gerald had thought of it differently. Gerald had thought of it as something that deserved a direct and specific acknowledgement. And because I had never been willing to make that acknowledgement, because I was, as he wrote with the gentle precision of a man who loved me completely and understood me entirely, someone who found it easier to be generous toward strangers than to be vulnerable with people who remembered me before I knew what I was doing, he had made the acknowledgement himself, quietly, without telling me, in the only way he could find that would not require me to be present for it. He had saved their building because they had 30 years earlier helped save my career. And he had never told me because he understood that telling me would have made it impossible for me to accept. I am not a woman who cries easily. This is not a point of pride. It is simply an accurate description. 31 years of estate law teaches you to be present with grief without being overwhelmed by it, which is a useful professional skill and a somewhat complicated personal one. But sitting at that table in the early hours of an October morning with Gerald's letter in my hands and the full weight of what he had done settling over me, I was not entirely successful at maintaining that particular professional distance. He had been protecting me all those years, in the specific way that people who know you deeply protect you, not from difficulty, but from the particular variety of difficulty that they understand will cost you more than it should. The question I could not answer, sitting there in the dark with cold tea and 37 years of marriage laid out before me in 3 pages of cream-colored stationery, was this: how many other things had he done, in that same quiet way, that I had never known about? And how many of them were buried somewhere in the estate documents that Arthur had left spread across my dining table? If you have been following this story from the beginning, and I hope you have, because I am finding that telling it is doing something I did not expect, which is helping me understand it, then you know that I am not the kind of person who tends toward drama. I spent my career actively working against drama. Drama in estate matters is almost always expensive and almost always unnecessary, and the families I worked with over 30 years were best served by clarity and patience rather than by the kind of confrontation that makes for compelling stories but terrible outcomes. I say this because I want you to understand the effort it cost me the following morning to do what I did next. I called Nathan, not to tell him about the letter. Not yet. That conversation required more preparation than a morning phone call could hold. I called Nathan because, and this is the thing that the previous night had made clearest to me, I had been treating my son and my daughter-in-law as people who needed to be managed rather than people who needed to be trusted. And if I had learned anything from 31 years of watching families fail to say the things that mattered, it was that the management approach always costs more, eventually, than the trust would have. Nathan answered quickly, the way he always does, with the slightly alert quality of a man who has been half expecting a call and is relieved that it has arrived. "Mum," he said, "how are you feeling?" "I'm well," I said. "Nathan, I'd like you and Claire to come to the house this weekend. Saturday, if that works. I have some things I'd like to talk through with you both." A pause. Not a long one. Nathan's pauses, as I've said, have a texture to them, and this one had the texture of careful relief, as though I had just said something he had been hoping someone would say. "Of course," he said. "Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," I said. "Better than fine, I think. But there are conversations we should have had years ago, and I find myself unwilling to wait any longer." After I ended the call, I stood at the kitchen window with my second cup of tea and looked out at the garden, the back garden that Gerald had maintained with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, and that Nathan had taken over after Gerald died, continuing his father's work with a faithfulness that I had always found deeply moving, but had perhaps never said so clearly enough. The autumn had taken most of the color from the beds, but the structure remained. The careful arrangement of forms and textures that Gerald had built over decades and that Nathan had preserved and extended without changing its essential character. Looking at that garden, I understood something about my son that I should have understood years ago. Nathan had not continued that garden because he felt obligated to. He had continued it because he understood, in a way that required no explanation, that it was one of the places where his father was still present. And he had done it quietly, without drawing attention to what he was doing or what it meant, because he was, in this particular way, very much his father's son. I had been surrounded by quiet people my entire adult life, and had somehow managed to be surprised when they turned out to have quiet depths. Arthur called mid-morning with the preliminary findings from the Land Title Office inquiry. He spoke with the measured deliberateness of a man who is accustomed to delivering complex information and has learned that the pace of delivery matters as much as the content. The Land Title Office records confirmed what the document inconsistencies had suggested. The property arrangements connected to our Heritage Preservation Trust were more layered than the straightforward picture I had been working from. There were agreements, properly executed, legally sound but never fully explained to me, that connected our trust to several other preservation initiatives across Vancouver Island in ways that had implications for how the estate would eventually be handled. None of it was problematic from a legal standpoint. Arthur was clear about that. But several of the arrangements required clarification before the estate documents could be accurately assessed, and that clarification would require the involvement of an independent estate mediator as well as archival specialists who could work with the historical documents involved. "There is also," Arthur said, with a pause that I recognized as his way of preparing me for something, "a safety deposit box, registered in Gerald's name at the Bank of Montreal branch on Douglas Street. According to the records, it has not been accessed since Gerald's death." I was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't aware of it," I said. "No," Arthur said. "I suspected you might not be." The box had been registered in 2001, 3 years before Gerald died. I did not know what was in it. I did not know why he had established it without mentioning it to me. I did not know whether its contents would be another letter, another explanation, another quiet act of generosity that he had not yet found the right moment to describe. What I knew was that we would need to open it, and I knew, with the certainty of a woman who has spent a professional lifetime understanding how documents carry the weight of unspoken human intention, that whatever was inside that box was going to change something about the picture I was only beginning to assemble. If this story is finding you at a moment when you are thinking about your own family's silences, the conversations that keep getting postponed, the things that everyone understands but nobody has said, then I hope you will stay with me, because I believe what I am learning is something worth hearing. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and turn on the notifications, because what we are about to discover inside that safety deposit box is not something I was prepared for. And I suspect you won't be either. In the meantime, Arthur arranged for the estate mediator, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who ran a respected independent practice out of an office near Beacon Hill Park and had a reputation in Victoria's legal community for being precisely the kind of person you wanted in the room when a family needed to have a conversation that had been delayed for too long. Arthur spoke well of her. The fact that Arthur spoke well of anyone was, in my professional estimation, the highest possible recommendation. Patricia came to the house on Government Street on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days before Nathan and Claire were due to arrive. She was perhaps 65, with the particular quality of stillness that I associated with people who had spent a long time being present for other people's most difficult moments. She sat across from me at the dining table, the same table where I had spent the previous nights with Gerald's letter. And she listened to the outline of the situation with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that the details mattered less than the shape of what was underneath them. "What is it that you want from this process, Margaret?" she asked when I had finished. The question was simple. It was also, I realized as I sat with it, something that nobody had asked me in a very long time. People had asked what I wanted from the estate planning, from the medical procedures, from the various practical arrangements that accumulate around a woman of my age. Nobody had asked what I wanted from the process, from the act of finally opening all of this up and laying it out where the people I loved could see it. "I want them to know," I said, "not just the legal facts. I want Nathan and Claire to understand why each decision was made, not as a beneficiary briefing, as a conversation, as the conversation we should have been having for years." Patricia nodded slowly. "And Gerald's arrangements? The ones you didn't know about?" I looked at my hands for a moment. The afternoon light through the dining room windows was doing something beautiful to the surface of the mahogany table. The same thing it did every autumn afternoon. The same thing it would have done on the afternoon Gerald sat at this table and wrote in his careful hand on his cream-colored stationery. "I think," I said carefully, "that I am learning that my husband was even more thoughtful than I already believed him to be. And I think the family deserves to know that too." Patricia stayed for 2 hours. When she left, she took with her a set of notes and a preliminary framework for what she was already calling, with a professional precision I found reassuring, a family estate communication session. Not mediation in the adversarial sense. Nobody was in dispute. Something more like the structured opening of a door that had been closed for too long. That evening, I returned to the journals. There were more of them than I had initially appreciated. 16 volumes spanning nearly 4 decades, filled with my own observations and annotations, and, here and there, Gerald's careful, marginal notes. I had not read most of them in years. Some of them I had not read since the years in which they were written, when their contents had been the immediate texture of daily life rather than the archive of a shared past. I found the second letter tucked inside the journal from 2003, the year before Gerald's diagnosis. This one was addressed to Nathan. It had been written but never sent. Gerald had kept it. I understood, looking at the careful way it was preserved, the precise fold of the paper, and the specific placement between pages that he must have chosen deliberately, as a record of an intention he had not yet fulfilled. I did not read it. That letter was not mine to read. Not yet. Not without Nathan present. I held it carefully by its edges and placed it back between the journal pages where Gerald had left it. But the fact of its existence told me something. Gerald had been trying, in the years before his illness made everything more urgent and more complicated, to find the right way to say the things that mattered to the people who mattered most to him. He had written the letter to Nathan and had not sent it. He had made the charitable arrangement on my behalf and had not explained it. He had established the safety deposit box and had not mentioned it. He had been a man full of intention and full of love and full of the particular difficulty that some people carry through their entire lives, the inability to find the moment that feels adequate to the weight of what needs to be said. I recognized it because I carried the same difficulty myself. We had been, Gerald and I, two people who understood human nature with considerable professional precision and had somehow managed to apply almost none of that understanding to the task of being fully transparent with each other and with our son. Saturday was coming. Nathan and Claire would arrive. Patricia would join us. Arthur would be available by phone if the legal questions required his guidance. And somewhere in a safety deposit box on Douglas Street, sealed for more than 20 years, Gerald had left something that none of us had yet seen. I put the journals away carefully that night, returned each one to its place in the drawer of the old writing desk, and stood for a moment in the study where Gerald had spent so many evenings in the particular peaceful solitude of a man who was at home in his own thoughts. I had always believed that solitude was something we had shared. Two people comfortable in the same quiet, reading our separate books in separate chairs, present without requiring anything of each other. It had felt like intimacy. It had felt like the highest form of partnership. Standing there in the study with the house settled into its evening quiet around me, I began to wonder whether some of what I had mistaken for shared solitude had in fact been something more complicated. Whether Gerald, in those quiet evenings, had been sitting with things he could not yet say, and whether I, equally, had been doing the same. The question kept me company through another long night. And somewhere, on Douglas Street, in a box that had not been opened since before Nathan's hair had begun to go silver, Gerald Lawson was still keeping a secret that not even I had known to look for. Saturday arrived the way October Saturdays arrive in Victoria, not with drama, but with the particular kind of quiet authority that this city has always done better than almost anywhere else I have known. The morning came in gray and soft, the clouds sitting low over the Strait of Juan de Fuca, the kind of sky that turns the water a deep and serious blue-green and makes the Gary oaks along the roads look as though they have been drawn in charcoal rather than grown from soil. I had been awake since 5, not anxiously, or not only anxiously, but with the particular wakefulness of someone who has something significant ahead of them and understands that the hours before it are not wasted time but necessary preparation. I made tea. I set the dining table the way I always set it when the occasion called for something beyond the ordinary. Not formally, not with the careful artifice of performance, but with the kind of deliberate attention that says, "This matters." And I want the space around it to reflect that. Gerald's mother had given us a set of pottery mugs years ago, thick and warm in the hand, in a deep teal glaze that had always reminded me of the color the harbor went on certain winter afternoons. I put those out. I found the good biscuits Dorothy had brought when she collected me from the hospital and had left on the kitchen counter with the quiet practicality that was her most consistent gift to me. I put those out as well. Then I sat in Gerald's chair by the front window and waited, which is something I have never been especially good at and have never pretended otherwise. Nathan and Claire arrived at 10:30. I heard Nathan's car before I saw it. He drives a dark green Land Rover that Gerald would have found practical, and I have always found somewhat larger than necessary, though I have learned over the years that landscape architects tend to have strong feelings about their vehicles that are worth the effort of respecting. I watched them come up the front path together, Nathan slightly ahead, and then pausing to hold the gate, Claire pulling her jacket closed against the October air. They were, I thought, watching them from the window before they saw me watching. A couple who had learned how to move through the world in the particular synchrony of two people who have shared enough difficulty to stop performing ease around each other. That is a rare thing. I had not given it enough credit. I opened the door before they knocked. "You look well," Claire said immediately, and then seemed to check herself, perhaps aware that immediately telling someone recovering from a hospital procedure that they look well is a form of reassurance that can sometimes read as relief rather than observation. She was not wrong, though. I did feel well. Better, in certain important ways, than I had felt in some time. "Come in," I said. "Come through to the dining room. Patricia will be here at 11. They settled at the table, around the pottery mugs and Dorothy's biscuits, and we had the kind of preliminary conversation that families have when something larger is waiting just ahead of it, careful and warm and slightly surface level. Touching on Nathan's current project, a restoration of the formal gardens at a historic property in Saanich, and Claire's work at the non-profit, a funding application that was proving more complicated than expected, as funding applications always do. I listened to both of them with the specific attention of someone who is hearing familiar voices differently than she had heard them before, and what I noticed, what the previous week had tuned my hearing to notice, was how much care was underneath the ordinary language of their daily lives. Claire asked twice, in 2 different ways, whether I had slept. Nathan refilled my tea without being asked, and without drawing attention to the gesture. Small things. The kind of small things that accumulate over years and decades into the actual substance of love, which is almost never dramatic and almost always looks exactly like this. Patricia Holloway arrived precisely at 11, carrying a slim leather folder and the same quality of gathered stillness I had observed in our Thursday meeting. She had dressed thoughtfully without overdressing. A charcoal wool jacket, a silk blouse in a muted amber that suited the October light coming through the dining room windows. She shook Nathan's hand, and then Claire's, and I watched both of them respond to her with the instinctive settling that people sometimes experience in the presence of someone who is genuinely good at making space for difficult things. "I want to begin," I said. Once the introductions were complete and we had all resettled ourselves around the table, by telling you both something that I should have said a long time ago. Nathan put down his mug. Claire was very still. I have spent my entire professional life helping families communicate clearly about the things that mattered most to them, I said. And I have, for reasons that I understand better now than I did a week ago, consistently failed to apply that same clarity to our own family. That is something I intend to change, beginning this morning. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who have been waiting for a particular sentence and are allowing themselves a moment to register that it has finally arrived. I told them about the hospital corridor. I told them that I had heard Claire's words, not as surveillance, not with any sense of violation, but simply because I had woken earlier than expected, and the door had been left open, and some things, once heard, cannot be unheard. I told them that what I had heard had not hurt me in the way they might fear it had. That it had, in fact, been one of the most clarifying moments of my recent life. Claire's face went through something complex during this disclosure. Not embarrassment exactly, but the expression of a woman who has been carrying a worry for some time and is suddenly finding that the weight of it is being redistributed. She looked at Nathan briefly and then back at me. "I wasn't," she began. "I know," I said. "That's exactly the point. You weren't angry, and you weren't calculating, and you weren't thinking about what you might receive. You were frightened that I would leave without us having said the things that needed to be said. And you were right to be frightened, because we hadn't said them. I hadn't made it possible for us to say them." Nathan was very quiet. He was looking at the surface of the table with the focused attention of a man who is processing something carefully and would prefer to do so without an audience, but was too present in his own family to look away. "There's more," I said. "And this is where it becomes somewhat more complicated." I told them about Arthur's visit. I told them about the document inconsistencies, the land title office inquiry, the layered history of the charitable trust. I told them about Gerald's letter. I watched their faces as I described what the letter contained, The Heritage Building in Fernwood, the family that had helped me 30 years before Gerald had written a single word about it. The quiet redirection of trust funds that had saved a building and discharged a debt that I had never known he understood. Nathan looked up from the table at that. "He never said anything," Nathan said, "not as an accusation, as a statement of recognition, the tone of someone identifying a pattern they have seen before." "No," I said, "he didn't. And I have spent the past several days trying to understand why, and I think it was because he was protecting me from the discomfort of receiving something I hadn't asked for, which is a form of love, and also a form of distance, and I am only now understanding how much of both it contained." Patricia had been listening throughout all of this with her folder open on the table in front of her, making occasional notes in a handwriting so small it was nearly invisible from where I sat. Now she spoke for the first time since the introductions. "Nathan," she said, "Claire, I'd like to give each of you the opportunity to share, if you're willing, what you've been carrying about this family's estate situation. Not the legal specifics. Arthur Pemberton is the right person for those. But the emotional experience of it. The things you've wondered about and haven't felt there was an appropriate place to ask." What followed was one of the more remarkable hours of my life, which is saying something for a woman who has had 79 years in which to accumulate remarkable hours. Nathan spoke first, and what he said surprised me, not because it was unexpected in retrospect, but because I had not allowed myself, in all the years prior, to imagine that he might have been holding it. He spoke about the experience of watching his parents manage their estate and their legal arrangements with the same professional precision they brought to everything, and how that precision had always made it feel, not intentionally, not with any unkindness, as though the family pieces of it were a domain where his input was not quite required. He had never been excluded. He had simply never been explicitly invited in. "And the difference between those two things," he said, looking at me with the steady directness that I recognized as something he had learned not from me, but from Gerald, was larger than it might appear from the outside. I listened to my 57-year-old son say this with the attention it deserved, which meant without interruption and without the instinct to explain or to reframe. It was one of the harder things I have done recently, which is itself a kind of information about me. Then Claire spoke. Claire is not a woman who speaks imprecisely. She manages the finances of a nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving historic buildings, which means she spends her professional life working in the gap between what things are worth and what they mean, and she has developed a language for that gap that is both technically accurate and emotionally intelligent in a way that I have always admired. What she said that morning had both of those qualities. She said that the conversation in the hospital corridor, the one I had overheard, had not been a new conversation. It had been a version of a conversation she and Nathan had been having, in fragments, for several years. Not about inheritance, about legacy in the broader sense, about what Margaret Lawson stood for, and whether the people around her understood it clearly enough to carry it forward when the time came. About whether the silence that characterized so much of how our family communicated its deepest things was a feature or a flaw, and whether it was too late to change it. She had not been frightened of being failed by me, she said, looking at me directly with the particular combination of precision and warmth that I had always found in her and had perhaps not acknowledged often enough. She had been frightened of failing me, of reaching a point where it was too late to understand what I had actually wanted and needed from the people I loved, and of realizing that the opportunity had passed while everyone was waiting for the right moment to begin. The dining room was very quiet after she finished, and I understood, sitting there at the table with the pottery mugs and Dorothy's biscuits and the October light coming in through the windows and Gerald's absence present in the room the way it always was, that what Claire had described was not a failure of our family. It was a portrait of it. An accurate and in many ways beautiful portrait of a group of people who cared for each other with great sincerity and had, each of them independently, developed the private conviction that the caring was somehow clearer to everyone else than it actually was. If you are listening to this and recognizing something in it, something about your own family, your own silences, the conversations that keep finding reasons to stay unstarted, I want you to know that you are not alone in that recognition. This channel exists because these stories matter. They matter because they are true in ways that extend far beyond the specific details of any one family's documents or heritage properties or safety deposit boxes. If this story is speaking to something in you, subscribe, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and stay with us, because what happens next changes everything I thought I understood about my husband, my family, and my own life. Patricia guided us through the rest of that morning and into the early afternoon, through a framework that was less a formal mediation than a structured permission. Permission to ask the questions that had been waiting. Permission to say the things that had been held back. Permission to be, for a few hours in a dining room on Government Street, a family that was choosing transparency over the kind of protective silence that had, with the very best of intentions, cost all of us something real. We talked about the estate documents in the broad strokes that I was now able to share. We talked about the charitable trust and its history and the values that had shaped it. We talked about the heritage property work that had been central to my professional life and to Gerald's later years, and about Claire's own work in the same field, and about the connection between those things that I had never explicitly named. The fact that Claire had ended up doing the work she did, at least in part, because she had grown up, in a sense, inside a family that believed deeply in the preservation of the things that carried history. She hadn't known that I saw it that way. I hadn't known that the connection meant something to her. We were, it was becoming clear, a family with an extraordinary amount of love and a striking shortage of expressed observation. In the early afternoon, Arthur joined us by phone for the portion of the conversation that required his specific expertise. He walked Nathan and Claire through the outline of the estate structure, not the specific figures, which would come later in the formal process, but the shape and the intention of it, the values it was designed to reflect. He spoke about Gerald's contributions to the trust structure with the kind of genuine respect that Arthur reserved for things he believed had been done well and with integrity. And then he mentioned the safety deposit box. Nathan looked at me when Arthur said it. "You didn't know about it," Nathan said. Not a question. "No," I said. "I didn't." "When are you going to open it?" I had been asking myself the same question for several days. The practical answer was that the process of accessing a safety deposit box registered in the name of a deceased person required certain legal steps, certain documentation, and a particular coordination with the bank that Arthur was already in the process of arranging. The practical answer was soon, but not immediately. The less practical answer, the true answer, was that I was not entirely sure I was ready for what I might find inside it. Not because I feared bad news. Gerald had not been the kind of man who stored bad news. What I feared, if fear was even the right word for it, was the particular experience of discovering something that would make me understand him even more clearly than I already did, and having to hold that understanding without him present to receive my response to it. Grief is not a single thing. People speak of it as though it has a definite shape and a definite duration, as though the losing of a person is something that arrives and then, in its own time, departs. 11 years after Gerald's death, I could tell you with the authority of direct experience that grief is instead a series of occasions, moments when the absence of a specific person becomes suddenly and specifically present in a way that is indistinguishable from the original loss. Finding Gerald's letter had been one of those occasions. The possibility of what the safety deposit box contained was another. "Soon," I told Nathan. "I'd like you both to be there when we open it, if you're willing." Something passed across his face that I recognized after a moment as the expression he had worn as a much younger man when he was moved by something and had not yet developed the composure to entirely conceal it. He had his father's eyes. I had always known that. But in that moment, in the October light in the dining room of the house Gerald had chosen because of the way the light fell on the fir floors, I saw Gerald in my son's face with a vividness that I had not experienced in a long time. "Of course," Nathan said. "Of course we'll be there." Claire reached across the table and briefly touched the back of my hand. Not dramatically, not with excessive sentiment, but with the matter-of-fact warmth of a woman who has decided that certain gestures do not require explanation. It was the first time in all the years she had been part of our family that she had done precisely that, and I understood, receiving it, that it was not a new impulse on her part. It was an old impulse that had finally found the room it needed. Patricia left at 3 o'clock. Arthur's voice had already signed off from the phone. Nathan and Claire stayed for another hour, and we sat in the front room, the room where Gerald's chair still held its particular place by the window, and talked about things that had nothing whatsoever to do with estates or documents or safety deposit boxes. Nathan told me about a particular Gary oak he had been working around in the Saanich Garden project, ancient and asymmetrical and impossibly beautiful. Claire told me about a stone warehouse in Esquimalt that her non-profit was fighting to preserve, its history more layered and more interesting than anyone had initially understood. I listened to both of them and thought, with the particular quality of gratitude that arrives sometimes without warning and settles somewhere behind the sternum. These are the people Gerald and I made, in all the ways that the word made can mean. Not only Nathan, born to us, but Claire also, grown into the family over 26 years of Christmases and arguments and ordinary Tuesday evenings and the slow accumulation of chosen presents that is the truest form of belonging. After they left, I stood in the hallway for a moment in the quiet of the house. The dining table still held the pottery mugs and the remains of Dorothy's biscuits. The October light had moved to the western windows, the afternoon angling toward early evening. From somewhere on the street outside came the sound of the neighborhood doing its ordinary work. A gate, a car, someone's recycling bin being moved. I went back to the dining room and sat down at the table, and I opened the journal from 2003 to the page where Gerald's unsent letter to Nathan was still carefully folded between the leaves. I held it in my hands without opening it. It was not mine to open alone. We had agreed on that, all of us, without quite saying it directly. Nathan would open it when we were all together. That was right, but sitting there with it in my hands, I allowed myself, for perhaps the first time since returning home from Royal Jubilee Hospital, to simply feel the full weight of what this week had been. I had spent 79 years learning how to read silence. And what I was learning now, late and slowly, and with the particular humility of someone who should perhaps have known better, was that reading silence was not the same as breaking it. Gerald had known that. He had always known that. And in the sealed box on Douglas Street, I was beginning to suspect that he had left us something designed not for secrecy, but for the opposite. Something meant to be opened exactly like this, in the company of the people who needed to understand it most. The only question was what, precisely, he had been waiting for us to be ready to find. The appointment at the Bank of Montreal on Douglas Street was arranged for a Wednesday morning, 10 days after Nathan and Claire had come to the house on Government Street. 10 days is not a long time in the ordinary measurement of things. In the context of what those 10 days contained, however, they felt considerably more substantial than their arithmetic suggested. Arthur had coordinated the legal documentation required to access a safety deposit box registered in the name of a deceased account holder, a process that required death certification, probate confirmation, and a formal letter from me as the estate's primary executor, all of which existed and all of which simply needed to be assembled in the correct order and presented to the correct people. It was the kind of procedural work that I had done, in various forms, for other families across 31 years of practice, and I will not pretend that doing it for my own family felt anything like the professional routine it superficially resembled. Arthur had also been in contact with an archival specialist named Dr. Susan Hale, who worked with the Royal BC Museum and Archives and had experience with historical estate documents of exactly the kind that our situation was generating. She had reviewed, in the days between the Saturday meeting and the Wednesday appointment, the Heritage Trust documents and the Land Title Office findings, and she had sent Arthur a preliminary report that he shared with me on the Tuesday evening by telephone. In the measured tones of a man who is presenting complex information and trusts the recipient to manage it. The report confirmed that Gerald's 1996 restructuring of the charitable trust, the arrangement that had saved the Fernwood Heritage Building, had been part of a broader pattern of quiet philanthropic coordination that Gerald had conducted, within the terms of his trustee authority, across a period of approximately 8 years. The Fernwood Building was not an isolated act. It was one of at least 4 specific interventions, each connected to properties with particular historical or personal significance, each handled with the same careful discretion that had characterized the Fernwood arrangement. 4 properties, 8 years, and not one word to me about any of them. I sat with that information through Tuesday evening and into the early hours of Wednesday morning, not with anger. I had moved through the stages that might have produced anger and had come out the other side of them several days earlier, but with a quality of wondering that felt both intellectual and deeply personal. I was wondering about the nature of a man I had loved for 37 years and believed I understood completely. I was wondering about the gap between the understanding we believe we have of the people closest to us and the understanding we actually have. And I was wondering, with the specific professional curiosity of a retired estate lawyer who had spent a career thinking about these questions in the abstract, what it meant for a person's legacy when the most significant things they had done were the things they had done without an audience. Gerald had not been hiding from me. I was certain of that, with the certainty that comes not from evidence alone, but from decades of knowing a person in all the ordinary, unglamorous, daily ways that constitute the actual texture of a shared life. He had not been secretive in the sense that implies concealment of something problematic. He had been private in the sense that some people are private about the things that matter most to them, not because those things are shameful, but because they are too important to risk exposing to a response that might diminish them. He had been doing good. He had been doing it quietly, in the specific way of a person who believes that generosity performed without expectation of acknowledgement is the only kind that retains its full integrity. And he had not told me because telling me would have required him to navigate my reaction. And my reaction, he had known me well enough to understand this, might have included the particular complicated resistance that I tend to bring to anything that touches the intersection of professional history and personal vulnerability. He had been protecting the gift by protecting it from my response to it. I understood that completely by Wednesday morning. I understood it, and I loved him for it, and I also understood that it had cost us both something, a kind of shared knowledge that we might have carried together and had instead carried separately, each in our own particular silence. Nathan and Claire arrived at the Government Street house at 8:30, and we drove together to Douglas Street in Nathan's green Land Rover, which I will admit felt, on that particular morning, like exactly the right vehicle for the occasion, solid and unhurried and larger than strictly necessary. Arthur met us in the bank's lobby, satchel in hand, with Patricia Holloway beside him. Dr. Hale had indicated she would review whatever documents emerged afterward, once we had had the opportunity to examine them as a family first. The bank's safety deposit room was on the lower level, a quiet, climate-controlled space that had the particular quality of rooms designed to hold things that matter. A bank officer let us in, confirmed the documentation, and produced the box, a standard metal deposit box, medium-sized, unremarkable in every visible way, except for the knowledge of what it represented. She left us alone with it, as banks do. We sat around the small table in the center of the room. The box was in front of me. Nathan was to my left, Claire to my right, Arthur and Patricia at the far end of the table. The fluorescent light overhead was steady and neutral. The room was very quiet. I looked at the box for a moment. 22 years. Gerald had registered this box in 2001, 3 years before he died, and it had not been opened since the day he last closed it. Whatever was inside had been waiting for this room, for this table, for these specific people, for more than 2 decades. I opened it. The contents were not dramatic in their physical presentation. A sealed envelope, cream-colored, Gerald's handwriting on the front. A smaller envelope, also sealed, with Nathan's name written in the same hand. A folded document held together with a paperclip, the pages slightly yellowed at the edges in the way that paper yellows when it has been preserved but not recently handled. A small photograph, face down, held against the side of the box, and beneath all of it, a single brass key on a plain ring with a paper tag attached in Gerald's writing that read simply, Gary Oak Cottage, Salt Spring. I looked at the key for a long moment. Then I looked at Nathan. "Did you know about a property on Salt Spring Island?" I asked. He shook his head slowly, his eyes on the key. I picked up the cream envelope with my name on it and opened it with the same care I had used with the dining room letter, and I began to read. Gerald had written this letter in the winter of 2003, he told me at the outset, the same winter he had written the unsent letter to Nathan that was still folded in the journal at home. He had written it, he said, because he had been diagnosed that autumn with the cardiac condition that would eventually claim his life, and because the diagnosis had clarified for him, with sudden and uncomfortable precision, the number of things he had been meaning to explain and had not yet found the right moment for. He had purchased a small property on Salt Spring Island in 1998, he wrote. A cottage on a parcel of land with 3 significant Gary oaks that he had fallen in love with on a single afternoon when a colleague had taken him there for a walking meeting that had turned into something else entirely. He had purchased it quietly, within his means, properly, legally, and had spent the years since making small improvements to it during occasional solo visits he had described to me at the time as landscape research trips, which they were, in the sense that they were trips during which he researched the landscape of a place he loved and thought about the person he wanted to leave it to. He had always intended to leave it to Nathan, not as a financial asset, not as investment property, as a place. As the specific place where Gerald Lawson had gone, across 6 years of occasional quiet Saturday afternoons, to sit under 3 old Gary oaks and think about his son and what he hoped for him and what he wished he had said directly more often. I read that sentence twice. Then I put the letter down on the table and looked at Nathan. Nathan was watching my face. He was very still in the way that people are still when they understand that something significant is happening and they are trying to hold the space for it without breaking it. "Your father," I said, and then stopped, because the sentence required a moment before it could continue. "Your father bought a property on Salt Spring Island in 1998, a cottage with 3 Gary oaks. He spent 6 years visiting it on his own. He wanted you to have it." The quality of Nathan's stillness changed. It was the same stillness, but its interior had shifted in a way that was visible if you knew how to read it, and I had been reading Nathan Lawson's face for 57 years. Claire reached over and took his hand on the table. She did it without looking at him, the automatic instinct of a woman who has spent enough time beside someone to know when their hands need company. Arthur was quiet at the end of the table. Patricia had her hands folded on her folder and was present in the specifically skilled way of someone who understands that their presence is needed, but their voice is not. I picked the letter back up and continued reading. Gerald had more to say. He always had more to say than he said aloud. This was, I was coming to understand, one of the foundational facts of the man I had been married to, and understanding it at 79 carried a mixture of recognition and tenderness, and a quality of gentle exasperation that I suspected he would have found entirely fair. He wrote about the 4 heritage properties. He acknowledged, clearly and directly, that he had not told me about the full scope of the trust interventions, and he explained his reasoning in the way he explained everything, carefully, without defensiveness, with the honest acknowledgement of his own motivations that had always been one of the things I most valued in him. He wrote that he had understood, watching me over the years, how difficult it was for me to be on the receiving end of generosity connected to my professional history. He had wanted to honor the debt without making me carry it as a debt. The only way he could find to do that was to handle it himself. He wrote about Claire. This was the section I had not anticipated, and it rearranged something in my chest in a way that I felt physically. He had written a full page about Claire, about watching her come into the family over years and decades, about the specific ways he had seen her love Nathan and had seen her love the work she did. About the afternoon in 2002, when he had driven past one of the heritage properties she had been quietly instrumental in saving, and had sat outside it in his car for several minutes, thinking about the fact that his daughter-in-law had, without knowing it, continued work that he and I had started years before she was part of the family. He wrote that he had never told her what that meant to him. He wrote that he had meant to. He wrote, "Tell Claire that I saw it. Tell her that it mattered. Tell her that a person who preserves what others would let fall is doing something the rest of us benefit from without understanding how much we owe." I stopped reading. I looked at Claire. She was very still, her hand still holding Nathan's on the table, her eyes on my face with an expression that I recognized as the face of someone who is trying to hold themselves together, and is doing so with great effort and complete dignity. "He saw you," I said. "He wanted you to know that he saw what you were doing and that it mattered to him deeply." Claire looked down at the table. Her shoulders moved slightly once, in the way that shoulders move when a person is doing the work of containing something large. Then she looked up again, and her eyes were bright, and she nodded once, precisely, the nod of a woman who has received something she had not known she was waiting for. I have sat with families in their most difficult moments for 31 years. I have been present when wills were read, and when estrangements were confronted, and when the legal framework of a life was laid bare in front of the people who would have to carry it forward. I have, in other words, been in many rooms where significant things were happening. That room on Douglas Street, on a Wednesday morning in October, with the brass key on the table and Nathan's hand in Claire's and Gerald's words on the cream-colored page in front of me, was one of the most significant rooms I have ever been in. We spent 2 hours in that bank room. We read the documents together. The folded legal papers were a properly drafted conveyance of the Salt Spring Island property to Nathan, prepared by a solicitor Gerald had engaged specifically for this purpose and stored here rather than with Arthur because, as his letter explained with the gentle precision that was entirely characteristic of him, he had wanted the gift to arrive separately from the estate machinery, in a context that was personal rather than procedural. Nathan opened his letter last. He held it for a while before he opened it, and nobody hurried him. When he read it, he did so silently, and when he finished, he folded it carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands on the table, and he was quiet for a moment that the rest of us had the sense to simply hold alongside him. Then he said quietly, "To no one in particular, and to all of us simultaneously." He really did know how to say things. He just didn't always know how to say them out loud. Arthur, at the end of the table, made a small sound that, in a less composed man, might have been described as a laugh, but was in Arthur's case more precisely a sound of deep recognition. "No," Arthur said. He didn't, but he found other ways. The weeks that followed were full of the specific practical work that significant discoveries generate. Dr. Hale completed her archival review of the Heritage Trust documents and produced a report that gave the 4 properties and their histories a formal record, a document that Claire, with a professional instinct I found both efficient and moving, immediately suggested be submitted to the BC Heritage Register as a supporting historical annotation. The idea was received warmly by the appropriate parties, and the process was begun. Patricia facilitated 2 more formal sessions, one to work through the specific implications of Gerald's trust arrangements for the current estate structure, one to allow the family to complete the conversations that the safety deposit box discovery had opened. Both sessions ended with the quiet, undramatic resolution that Patricia's reputation had promised. Not triumph, not catharsis, but the gradual settling of things that had been in the wrong position for too long. Arthur revised the estate documentation with the care and thoroughness that were his most consistent professional qualities. The revisions reflected not changed intentions about specific figures or beneficiaries. Gerald had arranged things well, it turned out, and the main substance of what he had built was sound, but changed context. The documents now included explanatory letters, signed by me, describing the reasoning behind each significant decision. They included acknowledgments of the people and values that had shaped those decisions. They included, in the specific language I chose carefully for the purpose, a record of the quiet acts of generosity that had formed the actual moral architecture of our estate. Gerald's and mine together, built across decades without always knowing the other was watching. The Salt Spring Island cottage was formally transferred to Nathan. He and Claire drove out to see it for the first time on a Saturday in mid-November, and Nathan called me from there in the late afternoon, standing, he said, under the 3 Gary oaks in the November light, which had gone gold and thin and beautiful in the way that November light on Salt Spring Island sometimes does. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He described the oaks, their specific asymmetry, the way one of them had grown at an angle over the years that spoke to some ancient negotiation with the prevailing wind, the particular quality of the space underneath them. He described it with the precision of a landscape architect and the feeling of a son who has just stood in a place where his father stood alone for years, thinking about him. I listened, in Gerald's chair by the front window of the house on Government Street, with the November rain beginning against the glass and the lights of the neighborhood coming on one by one in the early dark. When Nathan said goodbye and the call ended, I sat for a while longer in the chair. I did not turn on a lamp. I sat in the gathering dark and let the evening come in around me the way it had been coming in around me in this house for 41 years. And I thought about everything that had happened in the weeks since I had woken up in a hospital bed and heard my daughter-in-law's voice in the corridor outside my room. I thought about what I had learned about Gerald. Not a new Gerald, not a stranger, but a more complete version of the man I had already known, seen now with the additional clarity of his own words and his own carefully preserved intentions. I thought about what I had learned about Nathan and Claire. Not revelations exactly, but confirmings of things I had perhaps always known in some imprecise way and had never quite allowed myself to articulate. And I thought about what I had learned about myself, which is the hardest category of learning at any age and does not become easier at 79. I had spent a professional lifetime believing that clarity was a gift you gave to others, that the most important service one person could render to another was to make the complicated legible, to translate the hidden into the visible, to take the unspoken intention and give it a form that could be understood and acted upon. I had believed this so thoroughly and for so long that I had somehow exempted myself from receiving it. I had been the translator, always. The one who helped other families find their way through the documentation and into the conversation. I had not understood until this October that I had needed someone to do the same for me. Gerald had tried. In his own way, in the specific language he had available to him, he had tried. The letters in the journals, the box on Douglas Street, the cottage on Salt Spring, these were all, in their way, translations. Attempts to make visible what he found difficult to say. I had not had the tools to read them while he was alive. The tools arrived, as they so often do, when the need became impossible to defer. Several days before Christmas, I drove out to Dallas Road in the late afternoon. The winter solstice had just passed, and the days were at their shortest, the light going quickly after 3 o'clock, and the ocean taking on the deep, serious color it holds in December. I parked along the road and walked to the edge where the land meets the rocky shoreline, And I stood there with the cold coming in off the water and the lighthouse at the end of the point doing its quiet, faithful work in the early dark. I had the final signed estate documents in my bag. Not because I had planned to bring them to this particular place. It was simply that Arthur had delivered them that morning, and I had not yet taken them into the house, and they had come with me the way things sometimes do when you are not thinking precisely about what you are carrying. I stood at the edge of Dallas Road, and I looked at the water, and I thought about what a legacy actually is. Not the legal definition. I have the legal definition memorized in several different formulations, having written it and revised it and argued about it across 3 decades of professional life. The actual thing, the thing underneath the documentation. A legacy is the sum of what you have done when you believed no one was watching. It is the gift you gave when giving it required something of you. It is the letter you wrote and sealed and stored and trusted that the right moment would eventually arrive. It is the cottage under the oaks where you sat and thought about your son. It is the building you saved for a woman who didn't know you were saving it for her. A legacy is the conversation you finally had, even when it arrived decades late, in a bank room on Douglas Street on an October Wednesday morning. I stood at Dallas Road until the last of the light left the water and the cold had worked its way properly through my coat, which is longer than it should have taken and exactly as long as it needed to take. Then I walked back to the car and drove home along the familiar route, the Christmas lights of the neighborhood already lit in the windows of the houses along the way, and I was, for the first time in a long time, not carrying anything that belonged to someone else. What I had was my own. And it was, it turned out, more than enough. If this story has stayed with you, if something in the telling of it has touched something in your own experience of family, of silence, of the things we mean to say and the ways we find to say them, I hope you will leave a word in the comments below. Not necessarily something long, just the word legacy if nothing else comes to mind, because that is what this has all been about. The things we leave, the things we find. The conversations that arrive late and matter anyway. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and share this story with someone in your life who might need to hear it, because stories like this one are not meant to be carried alone. We will be back with another story soon, and I think, after everything this season has brought, you will find it worth the wait.